Marx, Marginalism, and Modern Sociology, from Adam Smith to Max Weber, by Simon Clarke. Preface to the second edition. I originally wrote this book because I felt that it was important to take liberal social theory more seriously than did the, quote, radical social thought of the 1970s. The main aim of the book was to develop a Marxist critique of liberal social theory, which could identify both the scientific strengths and the ideological limitations of such theories. The book was well received, but critical responses made it apparent that the central argument had not been widely understood, particularly by those who could only read Marx through the eyes of his orthodox interpreters, and so missed the distinctiveness of the interpretation of Marx presented here. The book was also read as a historical study, because it did not include an explicit discussion of the liberal foundations of contemporary economic and social theory, ending with the marginalist revolution in economics and Weber's sociology. Since the book was originally published, the intellectual landscape has changed dramatically. An uncritical return to liberal social theory has replaced its uncritical rejection. While the collapse of state socialism in both East and West has inspired the proclamations of the, quote, death of Marxism, I believe that these changes have made the argument developed in this book more, not less relevant than when it was first written. There is no better testimony to the inadequacy of the orthodox Marxist and radical critiques of liberal social theory than the recent resurgence of liberalism. The development of a theoretically sound critique is all the more urgent as liberalism once more comes up against its limits. The recent strength of liberalism has owed much more to its critique of the theory and practice of orthodox Marxism than it has to its own positive virtues. Despite the, quote, death of Marxism, the inhumanity of capitalism is as evident today as it was when Marx wrote. The central theme of this book is that nobody more clearly grasped the source of this inhumanity and the possibility of its overcoming than did Marx. But at the same time, we have to recognize the limits of Marx's achievement. Marx laid the foundations of a critical theory, but contrary to Marxist orthodoxy, he did not provide an all-encompassing worldview. Marx marked out a critical project, which was to understand and to transform society from the standpoint of the activity and aspirations of concrete human individuals. Marx's critique of liberalism sought to recover, both in theory and in practice, the constitutive role of human subjectivity behind the immediacy of objective and constraining social relations within which our social identity confronts us in the form of an external thing. This insight is as much a critique of the metaphysics of orthodox Marxism as it is of liberalism, a critique which I have sought to bring out in this second edition of the book. Although the central argument of the book is unchanged in this edition, the miracles of modern technology have made it possible Although the central argument of the book is unchanged in this edition, the miracles of modern technology have made it possible substantially to revise and expand the text. The main additions are in Chapter 3 and at the beginning of Chapter 4, where I have related my interpretation of Marx to those which dominate the secondary literature, and additional Chapters 7 and 9, which sketch the implications of the critique of marginalism and of Weberian sociology for the critique of modern economics, orthodox Marxism, and modern sociology. As with the original edition, I have tried to write the book in such a way that each chapter can be read independently of the whole. I am very grateful to Chris Arthur, Tom Baltimore, Gillian Rose, and particularly Bob Fine, for their comments on drafts of parts of this new edition, and to those many colleagues and students with whom I have had the pleasure of discussing the issues over the years. Chapter 1: The Origins of Modern Sociology. Talcott Parsons and the Voluntaristic Theory of Action. 50 years ago, Talcott Parsons isolated what he called a, quote, voluntaristic theory of action in the work of writers as diverse as Marshall, Pareto, Durkheim, and Weber. In The Structure of Social Action, Parsons argued that the voluntaristic theory of action was the basis of a fundamental reorientation of the social sciences, marking a decisive advance in the development of sociology as a response to the, quote, problem of order. Parsons contrasted the voluntaristic theory of action with the theories that the voluntaristic theory of action superseded: the positivistic theory of action and the idealist theory of action. The positivistic theory of action, quote, treats scientifically valid empirical knowledge as the actor's sole theoretically significant mode of subjective orientation to his situation, end quote. Parsons. In other words, the positivistic theory treats the actor as a subject whose course of action is chosen on the basis of a rational evaluation of alternative means to given ends. The archetypal positivistic theory of action is that formulated by utilitarianism and classical political economy. It culminated in the sociology of Herbert Spencer and social Darwinism and the historical materialism of Marx. An idealistic theory of action is contrasted with the positivistic theory in stressing the normative orientation of action at the expense of any recognition of the objective constraints imposed by the conditions of action. The conditions of action have no objective reality, but can only be constrained to the extent that they are given subjective meaning by the actor. Thus, quote, in an idealistic theory, action becomes a process of, quote, emanation of, quote, self-expression of ideal or normative factors, end quote. The archetypal idealistic theory of action is found in the German tradition, deriving from Kant and Hegel. While the positivistic theory ignores the role of normative elements in the determination of action, and the idealistic theory ignores the role of conditional elements, the voluntaristic theory of action adopts the happy mean of according full recognition to both, explaining actions as the result of the interaction of normative and conditional elements, recognizing that the subjective orientation of action cannot be reduced to the rational adaptation of means to ends, while also recognizing that the situation in which action takes place may impose objective constraints on the course of action adopted. Its superiority over the positivistic and idealistic theories seems self-evident, for it reconciles the valid elements of both within a broader synthesis. In the structure of social action, Parsons was concerned to establish that the voluntaristic theory of action was indeed to be found in the work of the writers whom he identified as its pioneers, and to defend the claim that its emergence marked a genuine scientific advance. While Parsons recognized that the development of the voluntaristic theory of action probably was, quote, in considerable part simply an ideological reflection of certain basic social changes, end quote, Parsons postulated that, quote, it is not less probable that a considerable part has been played by a, quote, imminent development within the body of social theory and knowledge of empirical fact itself, end quote, Parsons. The observation that, quote, it would scarcely be possible to choose four men who had important ideas in common, who were less likely to have been influenced in developing this common body of ideas by factors other than the imminent development of the logic of theoretical systems in relation to empirical fact, end quote, persuaded Parsons that the voluntaristic theory of action was indeed a scientific achievement, and not merely the expression of a common ideological perspective. Quote, the concepts of the voluntaristic theory of action must be sound theoretical concepts, end quote, Parsons. Parsons was not concerned to write the history of social thought, but to invent a genealogy and an ancestral authority for his own conception of sociology. While Parsons did establish the presence of a voluntaristic conception of action in the work of his chosen authors, there was only a very limited sense in which Parsons' often idiosyncratic interpretations were able to establish the presence of a more substantial, quote, common body of ideas, end quote, in their work. Moreover, in a book of almost 800 pages, Parsons devoted fewer than 40 pages to the development of the positivistic theory of action, and fewer than 30 to the idealistic tradition. Most of those few pages are at such a high level of generality that it is difficult to know what particular authors and works he had in mind. Had Parsons paid closer attention to the earlier traditions, he would have found the, quote, voluntaristic theory of action, end quote, no less prominent than it was in the work of his chosen authors. As we will see below, Adam Smith's theory of the, quote, moral sentiments played a central role in his liberal economic theory, while the balance between, quote, self-love and, quote, social love lay at the heart of Comte's sociology. If Parsons established the existence of the voluntaristic theory of action in the work of his chosen authors, he certainly did not establish its originality. The weakness of Parsons' interpretation should not lead us to reject it out of hand. There is no doubt that the end of the 19th century did see a fundamental reorientation of social thought on the basis of which modern sociology has been built. There is no doubt that Parsons' chosen authors played a part in that reorientation, and that the idea of a voluntaristic theory of action throws some light on the change. Moreover, the question posed by Parsons still remains to be answered. Is the conception of society on which modern sociology is based an achievement of a new science of society, or does it, after all, have an ideological foundation? One purpose of this book is to take up Parsons' challenge. The problem of order and the theory of action. Parsons' interpretation is determined by his focus on the problem of order and the, quote, theory of action. For Parsons, the problem of order was the fundamental practical problem faced by any society, and so was the defining conceptual problem for any theory of society. Parsons defined the problem of order in essentially Hobbesian terms, as an abstract problem posed by the antisocial character of human nature. The positivistic theory of action naively postulates a spontaneous harmony of interests, and so ignores the need for normative regulation as a response to the problem of order. Enlightened self-interest is a sufficient guide to action and a sufficient condition for a social harmony. Social conflict arises from ignorance and irrationality and can be remedied by education and science. The idealistic theory of action recognizes the inadequacy of this assumption and takes full account of the Hobbesian problem, but it divorces the values that determine the subjective orientation of action from the context of action, so that values belong to supra-individual and supra-empirical The idealistic theory of action recognizes the problem of this assumption and takes full account of the Hobbesian problem, but it divorces the values that determine the subjective orientation of action from the context of action, so that values belong to a supra-individual and supra-empirical order of reality. Both the positivistic and idealistic theories of action resolve the problem of order by referring beyond action, the former explaining order by reference to the external conditions of action, the latter by reference to the external system of values. Only the voluntaristic theory of action is able to resolve the problem of order within the framework of the theory of action. However, the problem of order is not an abstract problem. It is a concrete historical problem whose terms are defined by the character of the society within which it arises, as the problem of resolving the conflicts to which that society gives rise. The, quote, problem of order presupposes that conflict is a potential problem, and so only arises within a theory that defines the problem of conflict. The, quote, problem of conflict. The problem of order is also not a problem that is amenable to a single solution. The terms on which conflict is resolved cannot be taken as given, for the imposition of order must resolve that conflict on terms favorable to one or the other party to it. Insofar as a theory of society can be considered to be a response to the problem of order, every such theory defines its own problem of order, while we have to ask of that theory, for whom is order a problem? Parsons' formulation of the problem presupposes that, quote, a social order is always a factual order, insofar as that social order is susceptible of scientific analysis, but it is one which cannot have stability without the effective functioning of certain normative elements, end quote. Parsons. But this is not a formulation which is self-evident. It is one that expresses Parsons' conception of human nature and of the nature of society. In particular, it rests on the belief that the problem of disorder derives from a conflict of material interests. While this conflict can be resolved within an appropriate normative framework, it therefore presupposes a theory which defines material interests as conflicting but reconcilable. In a capitalist society in which economic activity has come to be dissociated from other forms of interaction, such a theory is provided by the theory of the economy. In the 19th century, it was classical political economy which provided the theory on the basis of which both the problem of order and the possibilities of its resolution were theorized. The classical theory of production, based on the model of the division of labor, established the complementarity of interest of social classes, defined by their ownership of the cooperating factors of production. The classical theory of exchange established that voluntary exchange must be to the benefit of both parties, so that restrictions on the freedom of exchange could only restrict the opportunities for self-improvement. Conflicts of economic interest only arose when consideration of the distribution of the benefits of economic growth was introduced. These interests were defined by the distinct laws which determine the revenues accruing to the various social classes. On the basis of their ownership of the distinct factors of production. Thus, the key to the resolution of the problem of order was the identification of the relationship between the interests of particular classes and the general interest of society as a whole. For political economy, it was the common interest in the growing prosperity of the nation which provided the criterion against which distributional conflicts could be resolved. The problem of order, so defined, was that of constructing a constitutional and moral order which would ensure that the common interest prevailed over the superficial conflicts of individual and class interest, which threatened disorder. For Adam Smith, order would be secured by an appropriate constitution, supported by proper relations of defense and authority, in which justice guaranteed the security of property and the person, whose normative conditions would be underpinned by the moral sentiments fostered by a wider circle of social contacts, while ignorance, which was the source of disorder, would be dispelled by an enlightened educational system. Comte did not share Smith's confidence that an appropriate moral order could emerge spontaneously from the interaction of conflicting interests, and proposed that the religion of positivism would be required to enforce the normative conditions of order. The German historical school, for similar reasons, called on the state to perform the same role. These various theories offered a range of diagnoses of and solution to the conflicts endemic to the new society, which gave greater or lesser weight to normative elements in the resolution of the problem of order. However, they all rested on the common foundation of a liberal rationalism, which they inherited from the political theories of the Enlightenment. They were all rationalist, in the sense that the appropriate constitutional and moral framework was determined by a rational evaluations of the benefits of such an order, and not by the desirability of order for its own sake. They were all liberal in the sense that the benefits of this framework were defined solely in relation to the ends of individuals. Moral and political institutions did not constitute ends in themselves. However, the rational individual who defined the conditions of constitutional and moral order could not immediately be identified with the concrete individuals, burdened with ignorance and superstition, and motivated by narrow self-interest, who inhabited the real world. The rational individual was a theoretical construct, which defined an ideal world against which mundane reality could be judged, and in whose likeness it could be reformed. One second. I don't remember where I left off. The rational individual was a theoretical construct which defined an ideal world against which mundane reality could be judged, and in whose likeness it could be reformed. The weakness of these theories lay in the abstract character of their liberalism. Although they proclaimed the freedom of the individual, they also insisted that order and prosperity depended on confining individual freedom within a constitutional, political, legal, and normative framework defined by their economic, moral, or historical laws. This weakness came to the fore with the rise of an independent working class in the third quarter of the 1800s, which based its demands not on the ideal rationality of the abstract individual, but this weakness came to the fore with the rise of an independent working class in the third quarter of the 19th century, which based its demands not on the ideal rationality of the abstract individual, but on the concrete aspirations of a particular social class, aspirations which could no longer be rebuffed in the name of abstract laws. It is in this sense that an adequate liberal theory of society had to be formulated on the basis of a voluntaristic theory of action, which could derive the conditions of order not from the theoretical evaluation of the hypothetical interests of the rational individual, but from the actual aspirations of concrete individuals who make up society. And it was in this sense that Parsons was correct to judge 19th century social theory as deficient. However, Parsons saw this defect as deriving from an inadequate theory of action. Marx, by contrast, had seen it as inherent in the liberal project itself. Marx's critique of political economy. Parsons followed the orthodox interpretations of Marx, which assimilate his theory of capitalist society to the utilitarianism, the historical materialism, and the class theory developed by classical political economy. These interpretations of Marx's work are quite inadequate in failing to grasp the power and significance of Marx's critique of political economy. The key to this critique is to be found in Marx's early theory of alienated labor, which was later developed in his theories of the value form and of commodity fetishism. These theories have conventionally been interpreted as a quasi-Hegelian philosophical critique of political economy, from the point of view of the human essence in the theory of alienation, and from the point of view of the historical specificity of capitalism in the theory of commodity fetishism. The interpretation of Marx presented here is very different from those which dominate the literature. The central argument of this book is that Marx offers a simultaneous critique of political economy and of Hegelian philosophy, which rests on his critique of the concept of private property, which is the presupposition on which liberal social thought constitutes the rational individual as its primitive theoretical term. This critique was first developed in Marx's theory of alienated labor, in which Marx argued that private property is not the foundation of alienated labor, but alienated labor's result. Capitalist private property presupposes the development of a system of social production in which the products of labor are exchanged in the alienated form of the commodity. The relation of private property, as a relation between an individual and a thing, is therefore only the juridical expression of a social relation in which the products of social labor are privately appropriated. This critique of private property immediately implies that the abstract individual of liberal social theory is already a socially determined individual whose social determination is implicit in the proprietorial relation between the individual and the things which define that individual's mode of participation in society. This critique cuts the ground from under the feet of liberal social theory in making it impossible to relate social institutions back to their origins in some pristine individual instrument or normative rationality. The only possible foundation of social theory is the historically developed social relations which characterize a particular form of society. Social theories could not be derived from a priori principles, but could only be developed through painstaking empirical investigation and conceptual elaboration. Marx's intellectual achievement was to develop a theory of the economic forms of the social relations of capitalist production, which laid the foundation on which a properly historical social theory could be built. However, Marx's social theory also provided the basis for a moral and political critique of capitalism. In establishing that the evils of capitalism were not merely the contingent effects of human greed, ignorance, and superstition, but were necessary aspects of the social form of capitalist production. Thus, Marx's theoretical critique of private property was at the same time a critique of the society on which private property was based, and in particular of the impoverishment and degradation of the working class. However, it was not Marx's theoretical critique, but the practical critique of the working class which led to the overthrow of political economy and provoked the reorientation of social thought at the end of the 1800s. From social reform to modern sociology. Political economy recognized the poverty, which was the lot of the working class in a capitalist society, and recognized that employers might abuse their powers to drive down wages. But poverty was in general not the result of any such exploitation, but of the limited development of the productive forces, on the one hand, and the excessive pressure on population on the other. The general condition of the working class could therefore not be ameliorated either by trade union pressure or by political intervention, beyond that required to check the abuse of the employer's power, but depended on the development of the productive forces through the productive investment of capital and of restricting the growth of population by the exercise of, quote, moral restraint. The political implication of such an analysis was that the working class did not constitute an independent interest, its improvement depending on the economic and moral progress of the nation as a whole. This denial of the independent interests of the working class could not survive the growth of trade unionism. Working class political agitation and the wider movement for social reform. A more pragmatic approach to the problem of order was called for than was allowed by political economy, and this approach was provided by various schools of sociology and historicism. However, the abandonment of the laws of political economy removed any coherent basis on which to address the, quote, problem of order, and so to evaluate proposed reforms. Political economy had provided a model of the ideal society based on the rational individual, against which to judge misguided reformist schemes. The pragmatic approach to social reform provided no means of setting limits to the demands for reform, which escalated with the legalization of trades unions. The extension of the franchise and the growth of working class parties, without an adequate liberal solution to the, quote, problem of order, which could recognize the necessity for social reform while confining reformist ambitions with inappropriate limits, there appeared to be nothing to stop the inexorable advance of the social reform towards socialism. The liberal response to the socialist challenge was provided by the marginalist revolution in economics, which set political economy on a rigorous subjective and individualist foundation. The basis of the marginalist revolution was the replacement of the classical cost of production theory of value with a subjective theory of value. The primary significance of this change was to undermine the classical theory of distribution, according to which the revenues of different classes were determined by different laws and were evaluated in terms of their contribution to the growth of production. For marginalism, the determination of revenues was integrated into the theory of exchange, as revenues were identified with the prices of the commodities from which they derived. The question of distribution was then a question of the initial allocation of resources, which was not a concern of the economist, but a matter for moral and political judgment. Thus, marginalism rescued political economy from the socialist challenge by removing questions of distribution from the domain of economics. The rationality of capitalism no longer lay in its dynamic efficiency as a system of production, based on the productive employment of the surplus product, but in its allocative efficiency as a system of provision for human needs. The, quote, problem of order was therefore redefined as the problem of reconciling the efficiency of capitalist relations of production and exchange with the equity of capitalist relations of distribution. Marginalism derived the rationality of capitalism from the subjective rationality of the economic actor. However, the abstraction of the economic actor from the social relations of production continued to rest on the liberal theory of private property, the naturalistic conception of production, and the rationalistic conception of exchange, which had been the object of Marx's critique of political economy. Thus, marginalist economics is as vulnerable as was classical political economy to Marx's critique. All that the marginalist revolution achieved was to reformulate the theory at a higher level of abstraction. The marginalists were quite conscious of the abstract character of their economic theory, and took pains to make the basis of its abstraction explicit. While this allowed the marginalists to claim the universal applicability of their economic laws, it also created the space within which complementary disciplines, appropriate to other orientations of action, could develop. Thus, where classical political economy claimed to offer a social theory adequate to the reality of capitalist society, the marginalist economics self-consciously developed a theory that abstracted from the particular social and historical context within which economic activity takes place. In this sense, marginalism claimed to offer not a social theory, but a pure theory of rational choice. The investigation of concrete economic and social problems introduced social and historical considerations. Social economics qualified the optimistic conclusions of pure theory, analyzing the extent to which inequalities of economic power, the development of monopoly, the perfect exercise of rationality, and the intervention of the state distort harmonious equilibrium defined by pure theory and introduce economic conflict into the model of perfect competition. While social economics continued to be a branch of economics, in presupposing the rational pursuit of material self-interest to be the only basis of social action, marginalist economics also left a space for sociology. Within the framework of the theory of action, economics is defined as only one branch of the social sciences, the science that studies the consequences of rational economic action. Sociology is then the discipline that studies the consequences of non-rational action and of action oriented to other than economic goals. The discipline that takes account of the normative orientation of action, and so that locates economics within the framework of the voluntaristic theory of action. The task of developing such a sociology fell to Max Weber, who was the most important figure in the structure of social action, and who took it upon himself to formulate a systematic typology of action as the basis for the social sciences. Weber classified social actions according to the ends to which action was addressed and the values that oriented the action. Within this typology, economic theory had a place as the theory that developed the ideal typical forms of rational economic action, while sociology develops ideal types corresponding to all other forms of action. Within this framework, Weber was able to locate capitalist society not in economistic terms, as a society which is subordinated to the pursuit of economic ends, but sociologically, as a society characterized by a particular value orientation of action, a rational orientation. This rationality is characteristic not only of economic action, but also of political action and of the value system of modern capitalism. The quote, rational economic action, whose implications the economists have uncovered, is not an ahistorical universal, but is an historical result of the wider cultural process of the rationalization of Western society. Although Weber developed his sociology as a critique of marginalist economics, he did not challenge the adequacy of the marginalist characterization of the rationality of the economic institutions of capitalist society, but sought only to locate marginalist economics within a wider cultural theory based on the, quote, voluntaristic theory of action. This wider theory provides the ground on which Weber could criticize economic liberalism from the perspective of higher moral values, which for Weber established the, quote, substantive irrationality of capitalism, in contrast to the formal rationality of capitalism as an efficient system of provision for human needs. Weber's voluntaristic theory of action did not solve the problem of order, but presented liberalism with an irresolvable dilemma. For considerations of equity and efficiency, of substantive and formal rationality pulled in opposite directions. Moreover, the fragmentation of modern society, which was the inevitable result of its rationalization, meant that liberal individualism could not provide any basis on which this dilemma could be resolved. The freedom of the individual was irreconcilable with the resolution of the problem of order. The formal rationality of capitalism, irreconcilable with its substantive irrationality. It is this liberal dilemma which defines the antinomies on which modern sociology is based, and from which modern sociology cannot escape, so long as it presupposes the marginalist demonstration of the formal rationality of capitalism, based on the marginalist abstraction of the property-owning individual from the social relations which define that individual as a social being. Although Marx's critique of political economy cut away the foundations of liberal social theory and provided an alternative basis on which to develop a more adequate social theory, the dominant currents of Marxism have signally failed to build on Marx's critique, reducing Marxism to a system of historical laws akin to those of political economy, and or to a philosophical critique of capitalism akin to that of romantic idealism. Marx's critique of liberalism has been used not as a means of transcending liberalism by replacing liberalism's abstract individual with the real individuals whose concrete collectivity makes up society, but as a means of suppressing the liberal dilemma by suppressing the individual in the name of abstract collectivities. The interpretation of Marx's work presented in this book is as much a critique of orthodox and Western Marxism as it is of liberal social theory. The hope which this book expresses is that the death of Marxism can also be the condition of its rebirth.